Very much. Before I get started, I'd like to say to my European colleagues, and indeed everyone, that I voted Remain, and I'm really terribly sorry. As did most of British academia, by the way. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to hear the previous talks. I'd also like to salute the fine quality of pun that's run through this morning. Death by chocolate was a personal favorite. But this morning I want to talk about something deeply, deeply serious. So the title of my talk is Indices and Eigenzeit, and you'll excuse my pronunciation, Characteristic Time and Networking. And so this, I'm going to start with this quote. So the entire talk draws quite heavily on the recent work of Wolfgang Ernst from Humboldt University, and Eigenzeit is his term. This is really a talk about temporality and the materials of technical systems, how we encounter them, how we make meaning with them, and particular as creative practitioners. I'm showing this quote from Ernst to remind us that temporality, mediality materials are very sort of processually imbricated. Looking at sound and time is a very good way to start thinking about time of media more generally. So as Ernst says, a Pearson account of indexicality is inextricably related to the very birth of our philosophical understanding of media as such. It relies on the particular qualities of resistance pertaining to specific materials, air, water, cables, etc. Our understanding of causality as essentially linear in time and space is founded on what experimental science has taught us about waveforms, from sound particularly, and the centrality of this knowledge in shaping our epistemological assumptions about the nature of signals and fidelity. Okay, this work takes sort of inspiration, is kind of founded from an interest in so-called media archaeology. And in particular in the focus on a sort of close reading of technical systems with a sort of slightly Foucauldian aspect, following the work of people like Friedrich Kittler. And I'm going to take this as a starting point to later problematize a sort of unproblematically causal and unproblematically contextualist view of indexicality, or at least I'm going to try. So as Ernst says, so this is basically as close to a definition of Eigenzeit as Ernst gets. So Eigenzeit, I should say, translates roughly, and there are many German speakers in the room who could do a better job, as something like characteristic or own time. So essentially, so I'm going to focus on Ernst's term as an individual or characteristic time delineated by technical systems existing, I will add, in extended ecologies of interacting artifacts, rules, peoples, conventions, infrastructure, and other phenomena. And central to the argument I want to propose is that that new arrangements of time, not just new experiences of time, are produced by technologies old and new. And not only does this have a manifestation in human experience, as for instance in some Marxist articulations of the impact on human working days, for instance in industrialized labor in Engels, but that new material arrangements actually embody new kinds of time, and that has all kinds of sort of interesting implications. So in previous work, and as a consequence of that line of thought, I've tried to describe some of the temporal arrangements of archives and archiving in terms of, for example, the sort of working patterns of servers, people in archives, interacting scripts, that kind of thing, as a resource for creativity. And as part of an aesthetics that sort of valorizes this kind of temporality, because it's very rich, effectively. Today, I'm going to try and extend some of that work into thinking what happens when you think about some of that stuff in indexical terms. So that's founded on an idea that indexicality is and time are very, very sort of interlinked. So in terms of semiotics and whatever, so terms like shifters, this and that, so deixis, things like that, they need to be located in space and time to have meaning. So that has absolutely no meaning except in as much as it's located in a particular circumstance of utterance. So, so if we accept that time is really important to indexicality, and then against a background of thinking that, well, actually time's getting kind of complicated if we look at it in these sort of interacting sort of ecologies of people and stuff, then actually having a, seems reasonable to have a think about that. And in doing so, we get very intertwined with claims about meaning. Okay, so in order to sort of kind of nuance this idea, I'm going to draw a little bit, and possibly inadvisedly, on the philosophical work of the later Wittgenstein, so in Philosophical Investigations. Because part of that picture of kind of being located in time and space is about context or contextualism. So there are, so as Bridges here puts it, many now believe that context dependence, though, goes beyond familiar forms of indexicality and is actually sort of like a real problem for semantics at large. So for example, it's wholly, so I'm quoting from Bridges now, it's wholly uncontroversial that some kinds of context dependence are pervasive. So, for example, if I say I'm cold, that has a different truth condition than if you say it on a different occasion. But many of these kind of contextual ambiguities are resolved, apparently, by looking at a sort of broader disambiguating feature, which constitutes what a so-called logical form. Okay, so which is something that lexically and structurally disambiguates. So, and that's usually some kind of index. So something like an agent, audience, time, location, demonstratum. Okay, but the problem is actually that if you start to think about those sort of contextualizing factors in terms of Wittgenstein's thought, it actually gets sort of turned on its head. Okay, so in Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein said, okay, if let's say there is a thing named by n, okay, so if I'm asked what I understand by n, I should say, a number of things and different things on different occasions. So if you ask me to say, okay, tell me about Bob, I say, okay, he's a lecturer, he's got funny hair. I don't know where I get these examples from on the fly. I should really write down the examples, I think. Okay, and I'd say different things on different occasions. So there are, so one view of this is that we basically contextualize our idea of n by sort of referring to a set of possible things you can say about it, a store of which we sort of select from. And there's a kind of continuous idea of n that kind of goes through those things. But actually what Wittgenstein's described is a scenario where instead of that sort of referring to some kind of referent which is in some sense already there, a scenario where discoveries about relevant parts of the world tell us which descriptions to associate with them. So I know it's a bit dense, I'll kind of try and bring that out in an example shortly, but basically what I'll try and show is that an interesting implication of indexicality for design provokes a problematization of our understanding of causality. So the focus on temporality, materiality, and events is not just to think about a context which supports an indexical understanding, but it actually provokes a consideration of how we ourselves are complicit in an accomplished sense of what constitutes an indexical sign. So this isn't just, I'm not making a definition between some kind of realist, causalist idea of indexicality and experience. It actually runs sort of far more fundamentally than that. So yeah, and as I say, the implication there is let's actually have a look at some of the times involved. Okay, so I'm going to do that by talking about some work, some artistic work, which is sort of related to works in design. So the first one is, well, basically Neurotic Armageddon was effectively a joke that got out of hand. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, but before I do so, when I was making this work, it was motivated by an experience of working with data APIs, like so-called RESTful APIs. And I got very interested in the extent to which you can perceive that data as live and consequently sort of indexical. And the extent to which that sort of liveness or timeliness, or whatever you want to call it, is not well articulated in documentation, for example, and not well reflected in the practice of actual data gathering, what we as programmers or artists or designers or whatever do. So to give you a really quick example, by the pixelated Twitter thing, it was supposed to be a GIF, but the Keynote doesn't support them, so if you can just imagine it flapping. Because it was live, no? Right, okay. Anyway, I have these ideas. So let's take an example from the Twitter API, so the search API in particular. So the idea is it returns the n most recent tweets by querying the database. And so if you're a designer or a programmer, you have to decide how often you're going to poll that to get the kind of results you want. And the decisions that inform that factor balance a number of sort of technical and other factors. So, for example, the API is rate limited, so if you ask it too many times too often, then it'll just say, no, sorry, you're being too greedy. So if you frequently request unpopular search terms, you're going to get repeated results. Similarly, if you don't ask often enough and it's something very popular, you're going to miss a bunch of tweets. So the client that emits the requests is going to have limitations based on its hardware, the network access, how poor a programmer you are in some cases. And so actually in an apparently simple HTTP GET transaction, we can already observe a host of conflicting factors affecting the way we use these things, and which affect the degree to which we can claim a kind of sense of temporal fidelity, a kind of up-to-dateness, a kind of liveness to the data we access, the end experience of audiences, and they all have a very sort of strongly temporal cast to them. So, as I say, Neurotic Armageddon Indicator is kind of an old work now that I'm revisiting for the occasion to just have another think about it. So essentially what it is it's an artwork. It takes the form of a small wall clock. There are a couple of them here. I made different versions at different times. So I've discussed this more kind of thoroughly in other published work. But what it does effectively is visualizes the current time of the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock being a symbolic clock, as many of you will know, which represents the proximity of humankind to the end of the world expressed as minutes to midnight. So 15 minutes to midnight, 3 minutes to midnight. So currently 3 minutes to midnight. I checked before we left, just after Brexit. It's unchanged. So the interesting thing about the doomsday clock is my original interest in it was that, so it's maintained by this academic journal, and it was originally hosted on the print edition of their journal and then on the website. So what happens is periodically a panel of experts come together and they talk about how dangerous the world is, based on the evidence in the journal. And then they have a meeting, and then they sort of dramatically and sort of performatively set this clock, and to however kind of dangerous they think the world is. So all my clock does is it's connected to the internet. You can see it's got a big Ethernet cable running out. All it does is goes to their website, scrapes the page, looks for the time, and updates itself. And it does that as sort of often as it can in this kind of neurotic performance. Oh, God, oh, God. So actually, it's interesting that, Jetmar, you were talking about the little flashing LAN lights, because actually one of the ways it performs that is through exactly that mechanism. The little light on the front you can see is actually, when it gets a new packet, it will flash. So it's kind of causally, indexically in some senses, drawn to this data source of the doomsday clock, but obviously behind that is a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on. So the claim to indexicality becomes not just a qualitative one, but one that rests on a kind of nuanced and accomplished understanding of the interplay between technical human factors sort of interacting in this kind of fairly complicated ecology. So I read this work as enmeshed in a set of ecological relationships in which we actively construct a sense of indexical sense, in the same way, actually, practical way we construct a sense of symbolism or iconicity and many other things. So my proposition is that our understanding of indexicality should be one of taken as a kind of heuristic tool to examine some of our assumptions about data and technology and the way that we use them. So it should be a kind of productive, sort of interesting investigation, and quite an active one. Okay, two more things I'd like to talk about quite briefly. Two more artworks. These are related. The Marginalia Machine and Blood Axe Archive, which is a Twitter bot. So these works were produced as part of a UK Research Council funded project of the type which is going to be very difficult to pursue in the future, thanks to Brexit. And the broader project was about based around an archive of contemporary poetry, which was being catalogued and digitized, and also at the same time being the subject of new creative work. So, for me, the most interesting facet of the project was that the kind of cataloguing and digitization work was going alongside everything else, so it was actually happening now. And given some of the claims to kind of archiving and institutional power and stuff, that seemed like an interesting opportunity to do something about the way that archives are perceived as live or not. So what both of the works actually did, so the Twitter bot at Blood Axe Archive released newly digitized images of poetry, so new manuscript scans from the archive of this publisher. But before the images were actually tweeted, a server script intervened to effectively hide the poem itself and to leave only the handwritten marginal notes around it and other kinds of marks. The second one, was the Marginalia Machine, was basically a plotter, a drawing machine, which did more or less exactly the same thing, but in physical space, in sort of exhibition contexts. So instead of tweeting these images, it drew these editorial marks onto a continuous scroll of paper, which you can see in the background of that image. Excuse me. Oh yes, good. So that's the machine drawing its thing. So, you get the idea. There's a lot of focus pulls. Here are some of the images. And you can see actually some kind of really nice things come out of this on a sort of material level, these lovely sort of abstract marks, little bits of, what's the word? I'll go for ambiguous text. So I don't know if you can read from there, but that says dubious, being promoted, Philistine. This one's, you can, yeah. Undamned is one word. Okay. So, yeah, actually, I had never thought about that. That's quite funny, isn't it? Undamned, it's not. Okay. But actually what I want to talk about briefly here is, so as I said, the aim was to provide an index to the activity in the archive. So an event wherein okay, here we are, folks, a new manuscript has been digitized. This is important. This is ongoing. This is live. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm too short to actually see a piece of paper over the lectern. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a problem I often have with lecterns. Okay, so what we're looking at here. Actually, I could spend a lot of time talking about how long I've got left, and then we'll get into one of those situations, won't it? Yeah. So the motivation originally was to think about how we could sort of recall some of the times of the editorial process as such, so actually by sort of reenacting in some ways some of the kind of writing processes. But if you want to index to those activities, then again, the sort of temporal situation is very complicated. So what I'm showing on the screen here is a folder checking script. So one of the issues I was having was, okay, so if I want to say a new thing has just been digitized, then really what I need is something that's going to watch a network folder and say, okay, is there a new image in it? Is the right thing? Okay, and then enact all the things that will tweet it or draw it or whatever. And there are various different ways of doing it, all of which have their own sort of affordances and such. So this way, basically, is a bash script which kind of looks, waits for a bit, looks, waits for a bit, looks, waits for a bit, and this one does it every sort of 10 seconds or so. The way I did it was using a so-called cron script, which is a server scheduling task that has its own sort of temporal constraints that go along with it, and that depends, by the way, on your operating system. So cron only allows you to look at things every minute, but actually, but it depends on the version and the time and various other things. So there's actually the kind of sort of temporal fidelity you get varies, not in this kind of really sort of complicated interplay between programming, operating systems, the network load, all sorts of things like that. Similarly here, the digitization followed the cataloging, so there was no API to the catalog. I was relying on the archivist herself producing data dumps of the catalog for me to access. Actually, we had a sort of personal arrangement that she would do this every so often, and I had to trust her. Also, is it on a Friday? Is she in the pub? Factors like that actually become part of the kind of constructed sense of liveness that I was trying to produce. So yeah, and as I say, so this is a sort of constructed sense of indexicality, which I don't think can be dismissed as giving an impression of indexicality. So indexicality is mediated. The material qualities of those media are themselves agential. So in summary, so I want to propose that indexicality has a use as an heuristic, that it's not simply about an unproblematic idea of contextualism. It has potential for an exploratory approach to time, and the sort of the contingent achievement of indexical understanding. So there's some references there if you're interested. And thanks so much. Ooh. Oh, do you know, I did so well until that point, I thought. Thank you. Oh,